think what design can do is really sort of address the idiosyncrasies and the problematic parts of a project and address it in a human way, both in the way that the product functions, in the way that the product looks, and in the way that the product enters your life.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Devers, and this is Clever. Today, I'm talking with internationally acclaimed product designer Yves Béhar. Originally from Switzerland, he grew up loving punk and windsurfing. In 1999, he founded fuseproject, his San Francisco-based industrial design and branding firm, and since then has produced groundbreaking, award-winning designs that have had a positive impact on the well-being of people all over the world, including 2 Index award-winning projects, See Better to Learn Better, free eyeglasses for Mexican schoolchildren, and 1 laptop per child, as well as things like The Happiest Baby Snoo, a robotic bassinet for soothing babies to sleep that's also being used in NICUs for healthier outcomes, and New Story, a collaboration with New Story Charity and Icon to design, plan, and build the world's first 3D printed community. His clients include Herman Miller, GE, Puma, PayPal, SodaStream, Samsung, Issey Miyake, Prada, and many, many more. And his works are included in the permanent collections of museums worldwide. He is a pioneer of venture design, a business model in which designers partner with startups and entrepreneurs, foregoing the traditional fee-for-service payment structure in favor of equity. A model that allows him to work on projects that have the potential to redefine their field and even define new categories. And recently, as of September 2021, he's released a book, a comprehensive retrospective of his 20-year career titled Yves Béhar, Designing Ideas. So here's Yves.
I'm Yves Béhar. I'm a designer and I work in San Francisco. I lead a team of multidisciplinary designers here at fuseproject, and we work on a lot of firsts that are human-centered. That's why I get out of bed every day, is to make a difference in people's everyday lives.
I love that. So let's talk about your everyday life, starting from the ground up. Can you paint the picture of your early childhood for me?
I grew up in a small town on the French side of Switzerland called Lausanne. And it's a cultural city with a lot of outdoor opportunities too. A very calm place, which is great when you're a child and drives you a little crazy when you're a teenager.
I recognize that feeling.
I have 2 siblings. We're 3 boys. My siblings and I are 2 years apart. And we're all big into sports, swimming specifically. We're very close, but we're quite different. My brothers are more in this sort of CEO management side of things, and I'm on the creative side.
And where are you in the birth order?
I'm the oldest.
That's interesting to me. I think I find a lot of youngest who end up in the creative industries. So you really are a pioneer in many ways. Growing up in the French side of Switzerland, a lot of outdoor activities to begin with. Did you start skiing, and at what point did you get into surfing?
Well, skiing was the sort of sports of choice in the winter. We swam throughout competitively, my brothers and I. I sort of fell in love around 16 years old with windsurfing, which I could do on Lake Geneva, which is our lake in Lausanne. And it was an amazing escape. I mean, you live in a landlocked country surrounded by, very large mountains, and being able to sort of just escape the sort of slightly conservative Swiss mindset and do something that felt a little crazy and dangerous at times was how I survived my teenage years.
Well, so something a little crazy and dangerous at times is also punk, which I understand was another one of your escapes in your teenage years. Can you talk about how punk was formative for you?
Absolutely. I was lucky to grow up in the punk era. It was not only just a defiance to the existing order, it was also very much for me a permission to try things, to be creative. During the punk era, you didn't have to be trained as a fashion designer or an industrial designer in order to create. You could just build things. They didn't need to be perfect. They needed to be an expression of who you are and how you're feeling. So I built my furniture in my house. I made clothing. I spray painted. It was a good way to rebel, but also put that rebellion at work. Create with others and really sort of start to develop my sense of design at that early age.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, like, at what point did your sort of interest in these punk ideals of making and inventing and rejecting the status quo and tinkering with the system translate into an understanding that that kind of is what design is, and that could be something that you could pursue?
Well, I see myself as being very fortunate because I really found my passion. I found what I wanted to do at a very early age. I think I was 15 years old, and making really sort of felt like the best way for me to express myself, to put ideas to work, and to creating a point of view, sometimes a counterpoint to what's being made, what's being presented to us as sort of that status quo of industry. It really became a vehicle for me to draw and to build. I had a little workshop in my parents' rental basement. Maybe my present for a 14-year-old birthday was a workbench. That's how I spent a lot of my time.
So even though there's something kind of defiant about this, you're feeling supported from your family system?
Yeah, I was supported certainly in terms of finding my own way. It wasn't sort of easy, growing up in a conservative environment, being and feeling, different or looking for other outlets. And, for context, most people didn't know what industrial design was back in the 80s when I was a teenager. And there were no really well-known schools for design in Switzerland. You had to really look out to Paris or London to find design schools. So it felt very much outside of the realm of the expectations of both my teachers and my parents, because in Switzerland, schools basically offered all the traditional liberal professions, being a lawyer, being a doctor, being a businessman. And I was looking for something outside of that. So yes, my parents were supportive, but they were a bit confused and maybe shocked at times about.
Yeah, right. They had no frame of reference, means they're like, maybe a little nervous about what this could become.
Exactly.
Did you have any role models for making, even any craftspeople in your family, or were you kind of the only maker as well?
I really think I was the only one. My father and my mother didn't work closely at all to a creative field, which meant they also felt at times unable to sort of help me or connect me in their sort of traditional, circles. And I wasn't even that great of a draftsman. I mean, I grew up with kids. My best friends were, incredible cartoonists and were great artists. And when it was more like a hard decision to become a designer, to find something I was really I really wanted to pursue, but I had to apply myself for a good part of 4 or 5 years to become a good draftsman, because that's how designers express themselves. At the other end of a lot of drawing and a lot of calluses on my fingers from doing that nonstop, it turned out it was something I could actually do well.
So how did you discover and make your way to ArtCenter to pursue industrial design, given that it was something we hadn't heard of back then and certainly not something that was local?
Yeah, there again, I feel the sort of stars aligned for me in a way that really changed my life. So ArtCenter was not on my radar because it was so far away. It was in Los Angeles. And I was looking at schools in England. Suddenly, I saw through the newspaper that ArtCenter was opening a European branch about 20 minutes from my home. And so that was the big click. And I applied. I got into a preparatory program for ArtCenter, then studied 2 years in Switzerland and transferred and did the rest of my studies in Los Angeles, in Pasadena.
So that really was fortuitous. And you've been in California ever since. California must agree with you.
Yeah, moving to California was so interesting. I think so fundamentally different from Switzerland in every way possible, especially when you land in Los Angeles from a small Swiss town. I think I was 20 when I arrived in LA, and then discovered San Francisco through a family trip. And it was clear that San Francisco was more of the scale and maybe more of the sort of cultural background at the time that was the right fit for me. And it was also a place where design was emerging, as I would say, a counterpoint to sort of the New York design scene. The San Francisco design scene was starting to grow in the early 90s. And so it became sort of a logical place for me to come. Plus, I have to admit, one of the big draws to San Francisco was the fact that it was a windsurfing paradise. That's how it became a very easy decision for me.
So with a degree in industrial design from ArtCenter, and you had studied industrial design, were you drawn to the technology side of design that was emerging in San Francisco at the time? Or were you thinking more along a different line and technology sort of seduced you later?
The technology was very interesting in those times because it was almost devoid of design. It was often impractical. It was sort of focused on enterprise applications. The early 90s was really when technology was just starting to emerge for personal use outside of the sort of enterprise applications. It really sort of was evergreen in terms of what design could do in the area. I guess I was interested in being useful and putting my studies to use. And with so much demand in the Bay Area, it completely made sense for me to be here.
So then what were the first few steps into the professional world like for you as a designer before you founded fuseproject?
When I graduated from ArtCenter, I felt it was just the beginning of my training. So I was actually not comfortable at all being on my own, being a business owner. So I really felt working for good firms, great firms, was the best way forward for me to continue to learn. Also, being a recent immigrant with just barely the papers to stay in the U.S., it took a while until I was comfortable both with the language, with my then, very thick French accent, speaking English, and my status to start, fuseproject. So I worked at the Burdick Group with Bruce Burdick, who was doing a lot of furniture with Herman Miller, for example. Then I worked at LUNAR Design, then got hired at Frog Design. And so those experiences were, very formative in terms of, learning how to be a designer, both from a technical standpoint, but, also being comfortable with this incredible openness that was the early 90s in the Bay Area. And this is really where, the biggest change, I think the biggest mental change happened for me was, usually when you're a young professional in Europe, back then it took you a very long time to be listened to be sort of respected, to be invited to the critical meetings, etc. Whereas in San Francisco in the Bay Area, I was thrown as a junior designer into senior meetings. I would be, surrounded by people much older than I, with PhDs in science and engineering and technology.
Oh man, that's awesome.
And they would still listen to you. They would look around the table and they would see the designer sitting there, and they would invite me to state my opinion, to participate. And the beautiful thing as a designer is I could translate some of the diverse ideas around the table through drawing. I could give voice to people's dreams and aspirations with a few drawings, and in a way create a consensus very quickly about where things could go. That was such a powerful experience. Actually, I think it reorganized my brain, because when you think about it, I spent 20 years as a Swiss person in a completely different environment from the very welcoming and very participatory world of San Francisco and Silicon Valley. That was sort of a shock of my early 20s. That was for the better.
Wow, that does sound transformative. It also sounds like an incredible example of how drawing really can sort of be another language in the room that everyone can understand, where there kind of isn't a language barrier as long as the ideas can get communicated and we can have kind of a rough visual and consensus of what we're talking about. Then you can communicate in a way that is often much more effective than words.
For me, that became a way that to communicate for the rest of my career. I can illustrate this point with, for example, my relationship with Samsung. At Samsung, I've worked with the teams there for about 12 years, almost continuously, which is pretty unique. I mean, I've interacted with, I think, 3 different CEOs. So I have a longer, sort of stint there than some of the top management. But what was really unique is there was a gentleman there who was a sort of chief designer of the company. And we became very close friends, but we could never exchange a word with each other directly because he didn't speak English and I didn't speak Korean. So for about 10 or 11 years, we communicated through sketches, through seeing and listening to each other's body language while always having translators in the room, obviously. But drawing is an incredibly powerful way to get close to people and people's ideas.
And so you founded fuseproject in 1999, and over the last 20 plus years, the studio has been responsible for so many innovative and pioneering projects. I don't need to tell you, but just for our listeners' benefit, like the sail chair for Herman Miller, Jambox, One Laptop Per Child, and Happiest Baby Snoo, among so many others. And so I know you've just released a book called Designing Ideas, which we're going to get into. But looking back over the last 20 plus years of the studio, I am wondering, in terms of you growing the business, growing the field, being able to participate in projects that are really important and meaningful to you, what were the stress points and exhilarating highs along the way?
Well, I think starting your own business is a huge step for anyone, and it certainly was a very big step for me. I tend to be more of the sort of creative, rambling mind in the room, and starting your own business kind of requires a different type of focus. For me, the big discovery was that we would get these projects, and maybe initially they were not that exciting, or they weren't projects you would think are the typical kind of industrial designer projects with high visibility. But then we would turn them on their heads and create something that was so unexpected that these projects would become very well known and recognized for how they changed the field. That sort of was a very powerful moment. It was a very powerful lesson, which is you don't have to look for the big project, the car and the airplane, or some very famous brand approaching you. You can actually build things from the ground up. You can help entrepreneurs, you can help scientists and visionaries build their dreams and become a part of that dream. And I think this is very much what happened with some of these early endeavors that were risky and had a lot of uncertainty, but at the same time were tremendous opportunities to create new directions in the market, create new experiences for people, maybe hopefully transform people's point of view and people's lives a little bit.
There's a couple of examples that come to mind. I'm thinking of Jimmy Jane and the work you did there as really transformative. But before we get into your kind of creative process and some of these specific examples, one thing that you've cited as maybe being actually helpful for you to be able to work with some of these scientists and visionaries on building ideas from the ground up is the venture design business model that you started to employ at the studio. And in that way, you've enabled a kind of collaboration that maybe wasn't or wouldn't have been as easy or possible before, and also enabled yourself to do better work. Can you break that down for us so we can really understand how it empowers you and also elevates the whole field?
Yeah, absolutely. So early on, after 2 or 3 years of Fuse Project in 2002 or so, I met some entrepreneurs, and I realized that they could only afford us for a brief amount of time if they could afford us at all. And then, so we would create a new project, a new product, and then that one would sort of go out in the world and sometimes be successful. And, the company would be sold or acquired. And I felt like, wow, I was a big part of this, but only for a brief amount of time for a very small fee. and
It's a little unsatisfying.
Mostly my focus was, how do we do better work? How do we support entrepreneurs over the long term? And what I knew from observing the more traditional design world is the best work has been done by designers like Richard Sapper and others, over long periods of time, where the more you collaborate with a company, with an entrepreneur, the better the work gets, because you both bring that outside perspective, but you also have a deep understanding of the goal, the aspirations, the insights of a certain field. For me, thinking around design venture, which was this new business model for us, was a way to really do better design work. And in the process, we also found success. We also found a new way to run a design company from a business standpoint, with an emphasis on the mid and long term value that we're creating, not just the short term revenue we can make in fees. So that was a cornerstone for us. We were in the right place at the right time, being in San Francisco, in the early 2000s.
I mean, I'm kind of interested in this also, and how it might ripple out and affect other industries. I've often felt like artists get a raw deal when they, create a work of art and sell it once for some fee that may or may not represent the long-term value of the work. The idea of having a little piece of ownership really appeals to me. I think NFTs are kind of, related in that this little piece of ownership that also channels the revenue back to those who were really instrumental in the DNA of creation. But then also with that little piece of ownership, everyone is, or at least those people are invested in the long-term performance of this. So also that means you have a lot more investment in whether it is extractive to the planet, how it functions, whether it lasts, if it's truly iconic, all of those things. The better work that you're talking about seem to be driven by the idea of being able to collaborate from the very beginning and develop these long-term relationships, and then be invested in the long term of the product or project.
Yeah, for me, the meaning of design, the original meaning of design, is about the plan, about the intent. Being able to work long term with entrepreneurs means that we can really get into those discussions early, and then we can carry them forward over years and years of an evolution of the brand, the evolution of the product, the evolution of technology that enables both of those things. I would say the first few years, I was able to collaborate with a large number of companies and help really sort of understand better the process of carrying forward strong ideas, a strong mission, and a strong vision. And later on, I was lucky to become a co-founder in a few companies as well. Now we look back, and I think we've been a part of some in some partnership and some co-founding function or equity owner function in about 70 companies over the last 18 years or so.
Wow, that's sort of mind-boggling and pretty cool. So I'm excited to talk about your creative process and this book that you've just released in September of 2021. Designing Ideas is a great showcase of that, because not only does it go through many of the projects over Fuse Project's history, but it details the thinking behind them and some of the contextual information around which they were conceived. I also just want to give you a shout out for the way it's organized, because I feel like organizing it into the subheadings of reducing, sensing, transforming, giving, humanizing, and scaling, also with a mixture of your own sort of oral history, plus some contextual information from an outside source makes it infinitely digestible and also fascinating in a way that means you don't have to read consecutively, but you still get the full picture and you can kind of organize it in your mind. So very nice. Love that. I also think it's a great window into the way you work. And there are a couple of ideas I really want to sort of pick apart with you. We mentioned it earlier, but under the transformation category, your work with Jimmy Jane, a sexual wellness company in which you did a rethink of the sex toy category and in turn designed some products that really changed the conversation and reduced the taboo around female sexual health and vitality, or at the very least, mirrored modern attitudes in a way that forced the sex toy industry to evolve. You acknowledge that sometimes the greater purpose of design is to change hearts and minds. And understanding this, if you're understanding this in the project, how does it actually sort of look in the creative process?
Let me answer the two parts to your question. I mean, the first part about the book, about designing the book or the format, was really an interesting one for me. I'm more interested in storytelling than the notion of marketing projects or marketing our practice. In typical designer fashion, I guess, I had to rethink or reinvent what the coffee table book format might be about. So rather than doing something purely chronologically or something that just presents each project in sort of a problem solution, marketing our work to it, I felt it would be more interesting to tell the stories of how things came about and also give a journalistic context for what was happening then. What was the industry like, or what, how were people thinking of a certain field at that particular time? And so it felt more, more humble to do it that way. It felt more true. And ultimately it felt, that it was a better reflection of the adventures that we went on, those journeys around these products and these stories. And sort of thinking now about Jimmy Jane, the way you present it, it was certainly one of these fields that was a little bit embarrassing to talk about back then. I mean, things have been quite different now. I mean, this was, I think, when we started working on it was 2008. And a very good friend of mine, Ethan Imboden, decided to start a company, focused on pleasure, and vibrators were sort of the outcome of that. We clearly saw that the industry was full of cliches, and the industry was using sort of materials and manufacturing processes that weren't particularly healthy. And, for some of the most intimate moments that we have as individuals or as couples. We talked about it for about a year, and then we started working on a vibrator, and it actually became a line of vibrators. It became 3 different ones. And it was not just one of the most interesting, projects in terms of challenging the norms, but it was also very interesting from a human standpoint, because not everybody was comfortable working on the project, even though in our studio at Fuse, both women and men were interested in discussing it. And so, we created this environment where we could talk about things that were quite intimate. We could kind of put on the table our reservations and our funny stories around the field. And I don't think I've had brainstorms where we laughed as hard and kind of shared as much of our lives ever before or since, in fact. So I love the project because of how it brought us together as a team, how we were able to build something that, to this date, actually the Form 2, one of the first one we launched, the Jimmy Jane Form 2, is regarded as one of a top seller and a top quality product out there. So it was really fun. But the premise was, let's create things that are beautiful, work well, are healthy, and that don't sort of, perpetuate these cliches. And so the objects are, for unaccustomed eyes, unrecognizable in terms of what they do to you. They're not anatomical copies, I guess, of or fantasies. So yeah, that made it a bit of a classic and certainly a departure.
I really appreciate you sharing that story. I love thinking about the team getting together and then being vulnerable with each other and laughing really hard and being brought closer together through this adventure in designing for pleasure.
Absolutely.
So also in the book, you talk about your work in robotics, which, we've seen with the SNU and with LEQ. And you are very vocal about the imperative that designers imbue robots with as much compassion as intelligence. And I think that's a really important subject right now, the idea of ethical AI. I just wonder what the creative process is around that. The obvious fear is that we're going to automate the human experience and accidentally end up with more isolation than connection if we design our robots so well. So I'm wondering how you approach that and how you draw those lines in the process.
Yeah, I think the words you use are the accurate ones. How do we draw lines as designers? Technology has presented to us such challenges. A lot of AI, at least a lot of the AI we experience on a daily basis, tends to sort of take away our attention, tends to distract us, tends to take us away from reality and from the important people around us in our lives. And most of technology really is designed for the comfortable middle part of life. When we're healthy, when we are in good shape, a lot of it tends to take advantage in a way of our participation. The value that we create through our participation is really extracted for not to our benefit. To me, that's not the best part of technology, and certainly not the best part of what it can do. And so I've been very interested in the last 10, 12 years in technology that really addresses the extremes of life, early life or aging, or when we have health challenges or education challenges. And technology there can serve us so well, not by replacing humans, but by complementing us, by creating a partnership between humans, their needs, and what technology can provide. And in so many ways, it's easier too, because it's much easier to train AI and technology to address very specific needs and to address these well and to sort of solve for a particular audience than it is to just create general purpose robots and AI out there.
What does designing a collaboration mean between a robot and a human?
So there's a number of principles that I put forth, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, about design in the age of robotics and AI and smart environments. And one of them is that robots and AI should never replace the human connection, and we should never sort of create things that make the robots or the AI sort of more connected to the human than other humans or animals. And so not creating emotional dependence is a critical principle that we use. And so when I think about, one of the, initially maybe more controversial projects I was working on, which is the SNU, the Happiest Baby SNU. I worked on it for 5.5 years, so before it came out, which is a pretty long amount of time to work with an entrepreneur trying to put their idea out in the world. One of the sort of critical elements of the project is, how does the function of the SNU really sort of complement parental needs and help them cope with stresses and of lack of sleep, for example. Postpartum affects 25+% of parents. And that's, mostly been recognized as due to a lack of sleep. What the SNU does, it replicates Dr. Harvey Karp's, who is the founder of SNU. It replicates his method for keeping babies asleep. And as a result, parents get 1 to 2 more hours of sleep, as do babies. And that has a tremendous amount of positive health implications for parents. And, but there was so much uncertainty when we started, so much reluctance to think of it in this way. I actually used that a little bit. So for those 5.5 years, people would ask me, so what's one of the most interesting projects you're working on today? Which is kind of a very common question I get. And I would say, well, I'm working on a robot that will take care of babies. And people would look at me, with their eyes open and
I mean, it sounds sort of dystopian. Yeah.
questioning faces. And they would be, that will never work. I would never do that. I think what design can do is really sort of address the idiosyncrasies and the problematic parts of a project and address it in a human way, both in the way that the product functions, in the way that the product looks, and in the way that the product enters your life. And that's what we did with the SNU. And it turns out it's an incredible new tool for parents, for hospitals. We're in 100 NICUs. And in fact, I want to say this because today is the 5-year anniversary of the launch of the SNU. So it's a special day indeed for this miracle product.
Oh, happy birthday, SNU. I was going to ask you if there's anything in place to kind of track any sociological information from the invention of the SNU through to like long-term development.
There's 15 clinical studies going on with the SNU. The SNU is used in NICUs in about 100 hospitals. And that's because premature babies need sleep in order to grow. And so adding sleep to premature babies is long-term, benefits. They get out of the NICU and out of the hospital faster. I can't speak to the clinical studies, but what I can say is from feedback from users, I did get letters, and we did hear from many parents who said, based on their experience of the SNU, they're thinking about having another baby.
Oh, we might have a baby boom on our hands, and it might be your fault.
So, you go from Jimmy Jane to making more babies. There are always long-term effects and connections in our work.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm seeing how the dots connect. I ask personal questions in this podcast because I believe that in order to humanize design, we need to also humanize designers. With that in mind, I would love to know if there is a chapter or an incident in your life that you would recall that might count as like a devastating heartbreak. I don't necessarily mean romantic, but one of those moments where the wind is knocked out of you and you're required to pick up the pieces and regalvanize your sense of self. And I ask that because I think that those challenges often inform the nature of our drive and our strategy for resilience.
That is a very interesting question. Yeah, resilience is critical, especially in the days that we live and the experiences that we've had in the last 18 months through the pandemic. There's heartbreaks quite often as a designer because most of the things you work on don't work until you make them work. And so grit and resilience are key. I'm often being told that I have a lot of endurance in that process. But I think, very early on in my career, I'll share something that I haven't told anyone, I think. Very early on in my career, in my very first job, I was actually not very good at it. It was a job in exhibit design. It took me about a couple of decades to sort of figure out how exhibit design really works. But it wasn't about creating that singular moment and that singular wow moment that sometimes design does. I wasn't very good at it, and I was told that I was going to be let go, but in a gentle way. And I was given a few months. Hence, began. This is still in the day of payphones, and I remember every single lunch, I would get some quarters, and I would get to the payphone in nearby the office that I was working at, and I would call 2 or 3 offices that had told me they may have a position for me in the future. And so I think for about a period of 3 or 4 months, I made hundreds of calls to the same person, to the same receptionist at those offices. Um, and eventually, one of those two gave me a job. But it was a time when, with the uncertainty of being an immigrant and having a visa on the line and not knowing if I was going to have to go back to Switzerland and how I was going to get through that transition. It was certainly a big awakening and something that has made me very committed to our international designers at Fuse Project, to the system of getting visas, of getting people permanent status, and I would say of all immigrants and refugees in general. Even though I'm sure my experience was much more privileged than most, there was a time when I was on the in this uncertain time where I may as well sort of go back home and live with my parents. I'm really glad it didn't happen.
Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And I can feel not only the uncertainty of perhaps having this new land that you call home kind of yanked away from you, but the uncertainty of having had a sort of career blow, or maybe even at working at exhibit design and not excelling. And I don't know, did that erode your confidence in some way? And now that you look back at it, are you kind of glad that you were gently encouraged to pursue a different aspect of design?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think every one of those big heartbreaks, and there's a few that came after that, when I look back, I can still feel, the anxiety or the pain around them, but I can also see how I picked myself up and the outcome was for the better. There's no doubt that, these failures, can lead to much better outcomes in the mid or long run. That gives me certainly a little bit of a philosophy in life, is that things do happen for a reason. And by putting our energy and our attention and our heart in the right places, we can, we do better on the next round.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So from your vantage point, looking far off into the future, what do you see and what do you want to see?
I think we're at the crossroads right now from an environmental standpoint. As human beings, there is a tremendous amount of transformation that has to happen over the next 10, 15 years. And that means every industry, every human activity has to be rethought. It doesn't mean that we remove pleasure or we remove enjoyment, which, by the way, that's what humans are built for. We're not built for long-term thinking, obviously, because we've been told about this climate emergency for about 30 years, and we've done almost nothing about it. I think we can rally and we can enact change, and I also believe that design has a huge role to play in that. And this will be a time when companies large and small will be tested. It's certainly a time also where I think industry is far behind what the desires and the wants and needs of the consumers. And, the role of industry is to fulfill those needs and wants for a more conscious level of consumption. But industry has a lot to do to catch up. Tremendous structural, logistical changes, experiential changes need to be made. Design has a key role to play in that transformation. And the winners and losers, will be very clear. Hopefully designers answer that call as well.
Yes, I think it's baked into most designers' ethos. Hopefully we can continue to really put our hearts and minds in the right direction.
That's the hope. That's what we have to do.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today and for sharing your story and your philosophies. I really enjoyed it, and I feel so enlightened to know that the sexual pleasure from Jimmy Jane is actually being followed up with the extra sleep that snoo provides. And I think you are making the world a better place, just, through a pleasure standpoint alone.
Well, thank you for that. I enjoyed the conversation as well.
Hey, thanks for listening. To see images of Yves' work and read the show notes, click the link in the details of this episode on your podcast app, or go to cleverpodcast.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Clever on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do us a favor and rate and review. It really does help us out. We also love chatting with you on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Clever Podcast, and you can find me at Amy Devers. Clever is produced by 2VDE Media, with editing by Rich Strotholino, production assistance from Ilana Nevins and Anushka Stefan, and music by L1011.